at the University of Manitoba. Stuart Oak has spent the past decade as an organic farmer, organizer, and advocate. He's a passionate proponent of organics, regionalized food systems, and food sovereignty. He's the owner-operator of Rooted Oak Farm, a CSA and market garden in Eastern Ontario. He's the former NFU Youth President and current Vice President of Canadian Organic Growers. When not in his field at Rooted Oak, he is the Communications and Government Relations Manager for the Organic Council of Ontario. Glenn Wright and his family grow grains, oilseeds, and pulse crops on their farm near Delisle, Saskatchewan. Glenn worked as an engineer for 20 years and he recently completed studies and became a lawyer. Glenn and his family have installed a solar energy system on their farm and are electric vehicle advocates. A decade ago, Glenn changed his farming practices to focus on low input approaches in order to reduce reliance on corporate inputs, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and manage climate-related risks by minimizing input costs. Glenn also drafted the NFU affidavit in support of the federal government in the carbon levy court case. Glenn, will ask you to go first. Please go, yes, Glenn, please go ahead with your presentation.
Thanks, Darren. Just getting myself off mute here. And hopefully this is able to be seen by everyone. Let me know if this isn't coming through clearly, but my goal here today is to talk for about 5 minutes broadly about my experiences in Glasgow at COP26, and then spend about 10 or 12 minutes at most talking specifically about fossil fuels and some of the developments that we witnessed at COP26 and some of the work with civil society organizations related to fossil fuels. So I want to start with what I took the most positive experiences out of COP26 for me was the climate marches. November 5th was the Fridays for Future March, where there were about 30,000 people marching in the streets of Glasgow. And then the following day on November the 6th was the Global March for Climate Action, where reports are scattered between 100,000 and 150,000 people that were in the streets of Glasgow. And I think across the UK on that day, they're saying there was more than 250,000 people marching in the streets. So I found that to be very energizing. And one of the other things I noticed in Glasgow is the electrification of transport. And so we witnessed street sweepers and numerous buses and a fleet of electric motorcycles as the one seen here. And I happened to have a chat with this officer, and he was spoke very highly of these electric machines. So it very much for me was a confirmation that changes in terms of electrification of transport, and even some of the discussions I had with respect to hydrogen as a clean fuel for transportation and perhaps for farming equipment, I found all of these things to be very positive and invigorating for me, because where I normally do a lot of my activism in Saskatchewan, it can be very draining when you're very much a black sheep surrounded by people who either don't recognize the climate issue to be serious or are actively trying to just, justify business as usual. So it was really encouraging to see so many people in the streets supporting the cause, and to see obvious signs of clean energy transformations underway in Glasgow. So the Fridays for Future March, I just want to say, was particularly inspiring for me. And I do think that, the younger generation are the ones that are going to lead the way on this issue, and primarily because they have a lot more to lose than older folks who may not experience the worst impacts of climate change. And so this is just an example of some of the folks I interacted with. This picture here, though, this is in the main foyer entering into the blue zone of the COP26 conference. So this whole conference, to me, seemed very much like a made-for-media event in many ways, and there was a certain amount of greenwashing that we all witnessed. But you can see here they had so many stations set up for media to be doing scrums and news reporting and so on. And I just want to give a brief description of how the COP conference works. There essentially are 3 zones. So there is the blue zone, which is where you have to be a United Nations delegate who's been, screened with security and given status either as a party or a party overflow or a press person or observers. And so we were there as observers, and that's kind of the lowest level of security. So there were many rooms we weren't allowed to go into and be a part of, but that blue zone is the United Nations sanctioned event. There was also a green zone, which did have about 3,000 public tickets issued each day. And if you had your blue zone delegate credentials, you could go into the green zone at any time at your convenience. The green zone is something that was sanctioned by the UK government and meant more to showcase specific initiatives, being undertaken in the United Kingdom, either by companies or by the government, or civil society groups had some booths there as well. And then the final kind of area is what we refer to as the climate fringe. So many civil society organizations were running events all throughout the 2 weeks of COP, all throughout Glasgow. You could go and attend these. You didn't need to be a UN delegate. The People's Climate Summit was one example, as well as the Land Workers Alliance and the La Via Campesina events, which I'm sure some of our other presenters will speak about today. And then the final thing I want to say in terms of general observations is just the security to get into the conference. This is the lineup after the first stage of security, waiting to get into the second stage before you'd get into the blue zone. And on certain days, like where the World Leaders Summit was underway in the first 2 days, and when Barack Obama spoke, the security was just tremendous. And standing in this line, on this particular day, it took us about 1 hour and 10 minutes to get in through all of the security before you make it into the blue zone. And there was a helicopter, almost like a military-style police surveillance helicopter, hovering overhead on the conference for the whole duration of the period when the World Leaders Summit was on and when Barack Obama was there. So probably at least four, if not a whole week's worth of helicopter hovering was present. And so it just is another indication to me of how much emissions were caused by the conference itself. And I think the security was actually extra because of COVID and the pandemic. And it was a very exclusive COP. Many of the people from the global south weren't able to attend because of the vaccine apartheid. But those are my general observations. And so now what I want to move to is talk specifically about fossil fuels for about 10 minutes. And that's because coal, oil, and fossil gas are really the key bad actors that are causing climate change. And so what I want to speak to is the causation components, as well as the influence that the industry has, our need to transition, and the specific positive developments that we witnessed at COP26. So in terms of causation, we know that fossil fuels are by far the primary cause of climate change. And so since the Industrial Revolution, 75% of the greenhouse gases that have been added to the atmosphere have been caused by fossil fuels. And over 90% of the specific greenhouse gas, CO2, is directly related to the burning of fossil fuel. And in the last decade, it's estimated that 86% of CO2 emissions come from fossil fuels, coal, oil, and fossilized gas. Now, the real problem here is that countries around the world today are still forecast to expand coal and oil and gas. And in terms of the budget we have of remaining room in the atmosphere to absorb carbon and stay within the 1.5 degrees of warming, we're already projected to produce 240% more coal, 57% more oil, and 71% more natural gas. So we're really in trouble. We're not being honest with ourselves. And during the COP26 conference, there was an excellent report released that I'd encourage you to read called the Fossil Fueled 5. And it's part of the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, which was also released at COP26. And these are just highlights from that report. So I'm just going to focus on Canada. The Fossil Fuel 5 refers to the 5 countries of the United States, the UK, Australia, Norway, and Canada. And so Canada, for example, here is planning to increase our oil production by 18% and our fossil gas production, or sorry, I might have that wrong. Oil production by 17% and fossilized gas by 18% by the year 2040. And at the bottom point there, to keep within that 1.5 degree Celsius warming, to minimize global warming to just that, we need average annual declines in production. And so that has to start right away, because the longer we wait, the more significant those declines need to be. Moving on to talk about the influence now of the fossil fuel companies. I was surprised in the middle of COP, we had a report, investigative journalists released a report suggesting that there were over 500 delegates. These are the blue zone people that were allowed in by the UN, vetted by the UN process. So over 500 fossil fuel lobbyists. So that's more than any single country had at COP26. So you can see how they would be just insidious inside there, influencing the negotiation process. And the other thing I want to show in terms of influence, this is pictures from inside the lobby of the pavilion. And you know, it was very striking to me that the countries that you see in these pavilions are the ones who are doing the worst polluting. And I mean, there were several there, and I won't go through them all, but it's very striking to me that these are the kinds of displays you would see with people greenwashing what their expectations are over the next few years. And this is what you see for Canada. So this is the Canadian presence at COP26. So all they had is a small room for their delegates. And myself, as one of the NFU people, I took the initiative to go knock on that door and try and engage and have a conversation with those people. But overall, I found that to be rather fruitless. But interesting to me that this is the kind of presence you see from Canada. Now, in terms of influence with the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, in the middle of the COP26 conference, this organization released a report suggesting that expanding Canadian oil and gas is the way to achieve the Paris objectives. And you know, the International Energy Agency also released a report before COP saying that if we want to stick to 1.5 degrees Celsius, there's no reason to expand any new oil and gas infrastructure. And you know, CAP's formal reaction is to call that unrealistic and impractical. So again, what we're seeing is more distraction away from what I would say are the hard truths of what we have to face. And your NFU team in COP26, we did issue a press release here, and we specifically called out CAP for their shameful distraction associated with trying to justify increasing Canadian fossil fuel production. In terms of the need to transition here, I want to highlight that on the left side of this graph, that bar shows all of the currently developed fossil fuel reserves. If we continue to extract all of the reserves that are only the ones under development, or that have been developed, I should say, we're going to blow past the remaining budget to hold global warming to less than 2 degrees. So that's significant. It shows just more evidence to suggest that there's no reason to expand fossil fuel or issue new exploration licenses or anything of that kind, because there's no way we'll achieve 1.5 degrees. And the difference between 1.5 and 2 is striking, because if we go to 2 degrees, we will lose all of the coral reefs and the Great Barrier Reef. If we can hold global warming to less than 1.5, we will still have some coral reefs that remain. But this is a striking difference, and it is extremely dangerous to think that we can continue on and just allow climate change to go unchecked. So in terms of the specific developments at COP26, in terms of the official agreement, the language, I guess, that was finally agreed to was to phase down unabated coal in the cover document and to end inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. Now, this sounds like weasel words and very watered down, because it is, but the important thing here is that for the first time after 25 prior COPs, we do have explicit language here focused on coal and fossil fuels, which prior to that, we'd only ever talked about emissions. And that is by design. It was continued lobbying by the fossil fuel industry to direct attention away from coal, oil, and natural gas. But probably the more important thing was the finalization of the official rule book associated with Article 6 of the Paris Agreement. So now that that's been finalized, it's really set the stage for carbon markets to develop for the internationally transferred mitigation objectives. And also it could set the stage or be the prerequisite for international border adjustment tariffs related to carbon. Other than the official agreement, though, what we noticed at COP was that there were several countries that were there issuing pledges. And those pledges are sort of like promises. I thought of it more as a marketing gimmick from each country. And so many countries got together and pledged to reduce methane emissions, to curb deforestation, and to end the sale of internal combustion engines by 2040. Now, Canada did better than that in their promises. Bear in mind, these are just pledges, though, but we promised to put a hard cap on oil and gas emissions. And I think that's important because it means that we're not going to emit anymore, but it doesn't mean that we're necessarily going to not produce anymore. So to me, this is a very strong implication that we're probably going to see carbon capture and storage technology in Canada. The other pledges were to phase out internal combustion engines in transportation by 2035, and also to reduce our oil and gas methane emissions by 75%. So these are significant.
Glenn, if you could you wrap up maybe within 2 minutes?
Yeah, I've only got 2 slides left, I think.
Really good, thank you.
The other developments at COP were from the civil society groups, and that's the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which I can talk more about later, but I know I'm out of time, so I'll just wrap up fairly quickly here. These are the press releases that came from your team in Glasgow, specifically focused on fossil fuels, and I won't bother reading them, but again, it's important, I think, that we are focusing on those causes. And I guess this is my final slide, and I just want to focus on the net zero component here, because there's a big difference between 1 million minus a million compared to 1,000 minus 1,000. And what I'm trying to say by that math is that don't let the net zero argument allow the bad polluters to just proceed with business as usual. We need to reduce as much as we can so that when we get to the sectors that we can't reduce at all, we only have a small amount of offsetting to do, not a tremendous amount of offsetting. So that's my summary, and I'm happy to turn it over to the other presenters, but I just want to thank you for the opportunity to go to COP. It was really worthwhile.
Thank you very much, Glenn. That was really fantastic. Thank you. Stuart, do you want to go ahead, please? Glenn, if you can unshare your screen.
Perfect. I'm suddenly very grateful to be going second, and grateful for Glenn for doing all of that work that has, I feel like, taken some pressure off me to try and capture everything that was in there. Similarly to Glenn, I'm just going to start off with some brief personal reflections, and then I'm going to focus more on some of the agriculture-specific initiatives that were announced at COP26. I've done quite a bit of reflecting, both while there at COP26 and since coming home, on the value we were able to bring to our participation there, and how to participate. I think all of us felt the weight of traveling across the world for a climate conference, to try to participate and try to sound the alarm bells that many of us are feeling in very real ways across the country right now. And much like Glenn, there was plenty of hypocrisy to go around in terms of the amount of good faith conversations that were being had about how to actually deal with the climate crisis, or whether we should look at ways just to make more money. And depending on the person in the conversation, you might find one or the other. And in general, my perception was that there were both some important conversations in the formal UN spaces that Glenn described, and there was also some really important conversations which happened outside of those formal UN spaces in a lot of the parallel events that were happening and organized by civil society groups and some farmer groups and indigenous groups, and a broad swath of people that had come to Glasgow as well, but not necessarily to participate in the formal spaces. And so we had enough people within the NFU contingent there that we could meaningfully participate in both of those spaces. and able to absorb and participate and bring our experience to both of them. And some of my biggest takeaways and some of the biggest value I think that we could contribute was actually in those spaces outside of the formal UN space, in a lot of the movement building that was happening in parallel. And I think when we look at some of the biggest social movements and some of the biggest tasks that we've done both globally and domestically, it's been when different groups come together and work on the same issues. And so you increasingly saw groups from all corners of our society that are usually interested in their one very specific issue branch out and come together at this climate conference and look at their issue through the lens of others. And those kind of connections and that kind of movement building, I think, is something that is really critical and doesn't go away even after the 2 weeks that we were there. And so increasingly coming home, reflecting on our role there, it's become even more clear to me that, you know, the biggest job was not at COP. The biggest job is now that we're home and holding our government to account and to follow up on in what was in many cases non-binding pledges that they made, and making sure that they actually follow through. So those are my personal reflections, and so I'll just quickly share my screen here. And just talk a little bit about, hey, can somebody see, are you seeing just my whole screen, or is it just the slide deck?
No, we're seeing your whole screen.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about agriculture at COP26, and I'll start off by saying that comparatively to how big a contributor agriculture represents to global emissions, somewhere around 25% is attributed to agriculture globally, it actually played a surprisingly little role at COP26. And I can only speculate as to why that might be, but definitely over the course of the 2 weeks, it seemed like every issue under the sun had a special themed day at COP26: energy, transportation, youth, so on and so forth. But agriculture didn't really have a specific day that it was discussed, and it seemed to be discussed only around the margins of conversations. And I'm not sure whether that's because it's been historically a very difficult issue for decision makers to wrap their hands around in these international spaces, because it's so difficult to make substantial reductions in agriculture, whether that's because, I mean, the list could go on. We don't know why that is, but it definitely played a really small role at COP. So the three main things I do want to touch on that were announced at COP26: the Agricultural Innovation Mission for Climate, or AIM4C, of which Canada is a partner signatory in. There's also a UK initiative, which is more focused around the developing world, called Climate Shot. And then finally, there were updates to the Coronivia Agreement, which has been around for almost a decade. It was started, discussions around it started in 2011, and updates made in 2017. So starting with the Agricultural Innovation Mission for Climate. It's a joint federal, it's a joint public-private partnership, which the two main public sponsors are the United States and the United Arab Emirates. And it's trying to seeks to address the climate crisis by uniting participants to significantly, sorry, let me just go back here. Significantly increase innovation on climate, in particular using climate smart agriculture. And so I'm just going to play this video, which is sufficiently nebulous and mysterious that they released around the launch of it. I wanted to show that because throughout COP26, when agriculture was discussed, it was very much discussed through the lens of corporate-centric approaches to how to deal with the climate crisis. And when we take a look behind the sort of glitzy, glamorous video that you just saw, I think we get into the meat and potatoes of things. I mean, if you just watch that video, you would think that, you know, we can just wave our iPhones and iPads and fly our drones around and we would deal with the climate crisis. But when you really get into the meat and potatoes of the whole thing, it's a $4 billion joint public-private partnership, which is promoting this idea of climate smart agriculture, which is not particularly new in the context of agriculture, but it's one that reinforces kind of the status quo approach to our current agricultural systems today, and takes a corporate-centric approach, which invests in top-down solutions, which have been proven to reduce farmer net incomes. So, you know, when you really start to hear the specifics of what the plan, they talk a lot about climate resilient seeds. And when you look at a list of the private funding, comes from Bayer and Syngenta and BSAF and CropLife, and a lot of the same people that are producing the agricultural inputs and seeds right now that are patent protected and have extracted an enormous amount of wealth from farmers over the last 40 or 50 years. And you start to get the sense that some of the solutions they're talking about are going to do the exact same thing for farmers, except now they're tapping into climate finance and the green funding that is available, but that money is going into the hands of the same players that are hugely responsible for creating the inputs that are generating all the agricultural inputs that we're trying to reduce right now. So the idea that these same companies all of a sudden are going to be white knights in the quest to reduce climate emissions when it comes to agriculture seems a little bit disingenuous at best. And then finally, looking at these initiatives, farmers were largely left out of the discussion. When we look at how 80% of the food is produced in the world, which is by small-scale farmers on 2 hectares or less, those people largely weren't at COP26, mostly because of the vaccine apartheid that Glenn mentioned. So those voices, when we needed them critically, because they have been growing food in the developing world with significantly fewer emissions when compared to the developed, and also producing the majority of the food in the world, there's something to be learned. It's not exactly analogous to how we're producing food in Canada, but certainly those voices would have been really critical, and they weren't present at COP26. So this is just a screen grab that I quickly took of all of the private sponsors of this Aim for C initiative. Some of them I mentioned. Lots of them you'll recognize, and maybe some of them won't, but an overemphasis on the same input-driven, profit-seeking agricultural solutions that we have seen for the last 40 years, but now applied through sort of a green lens. So makes you wonder who is this for and who's getting what out of this, and are we just seeing another gold rush around climate finance now? And so I was asking myself, who benefits the whole time when I was looking at these agricultural initiatives that were being announced at COP26. The other initiative, how am I doing for time, Darren?
You got about 1.5 minutes, 2 minutes.
Okay, I'll skip this video. But if you Google climate shot, you'll see almost the exact same video as the one that I showed you, but put out by a different set of players. But a lot of the funders are the same for this climate shot initiative, which is trying to provide funding to the same groups of people as in the previous one. And it was an initiative that was led by the UK and meant to fund countries in the developing world, but with the same emphasis on a corporate-centric approach. So I was going to show you them both because they're largely the same video and use the same buzzwords, but I don't have time for that. So
we're facing nothing less.
We'll pause that and pivot just to the Cornidia joint work on agriculture. As I said, it began in 2011 in an effort to create a framework that lays out a roadmap for global agriculture. And then in 2017, there was a decision which highlighted the unique role of agriculture in tackling climate change. It's the only program to focus on agriculture and food security under the UNFCCC. And at COP26, negotiations continued largely behind closed doors, which we didn't have access to. But in speaking with people that were in those sessions, it seems like the direction is heading largely in the same direction as those other two joint agreements that I talked about, including the removal of agroecological methods and terminology, the methods which are being used by smallholder farms all over the world. So that there was no conclusions on that joint framework. And it will continue to rise its head in COP26 in the future, but I wanted to spotlight that as it's an ongoing agricultural work at the international level. So quickly, and I'm happy to get into this in the questions, but technology clearly has a role to play in dealing with the climate crisis, but what role does it actually play? If some of the solutions that were being proposed there are bad, as I'm saying, what role does technology play in a positive lens? Certainly, open source technology is important if we're trying to adopt and propel this technology forward as fast as possible. Then it needs to be open source and applicable to as large a group of farmers as possible. It needs to be farmer-led and informed. It needs to be focused on reducing our emissions and not focused solely for the profit of those who are developing it. And it needs to support farmers to integrate the practices that have a tangible effect in reducing on-farm emissions. In an earlier conversation around practices that farmers can adopt that can have a tangible effect on reducing their emissions, I was speaking with a colleague and they were saying, with everybody so keen on the idea of technological innovation, it's very difficult to sell grazing livestock on a cover crop as like a sexy technological innovation. But the truth is that practices like that might have more of a tangible effect than adopting some of these high-priced solutions that the corporate sector would have you believe are the only solution to getting ourselves out of the climate crisis. And then finally, we need to have solutions that don't rely on the offsets and carbon markets and the net zero pledges that Glenn touched on, which really give a permission structure for the continuing emissions creation without substantially reducing them. And then just finally, some reflections from COP26. Farmers and food producers largely not present there for conversations, especially those from the global south that produce 80% of the world's food on 2 hectares or less. There was an over-reliance on technological solutions rooted in corporate-centric, profit-driven strategies. There was little appetite for the adaptation financing, which is really needed for farmers in the global south who are really feeling the effects of the climate crisis more acutely and often are not at all responsible for the situation that we find ourselves in, not to the same degree that certainly the developed world is. And finally, as I hope you've been able to take away from this, that the conversation is being overwhelmingly shaped by corporate players in the agro-industrial complex who are greenwashing their work to access climate financing and with a very real possibility of the further exploitation of farmers and net revenues that we've seen for decades. So I'll leave it at that. Happy to get into the meat and potatoes and the questions.
Thank you very much, Stuart. That was an excellent presentation and fit well with Glenn's, and really looking forward to hearing Jesse's presentation. So Jesse, do you want to please take it away?
Sure. I think I'm going to get Rebecca to share my slides. You ready, Becca? Yeah. Okay. She's in the other room. All right. Well, much appreciate the comments that have been given so far. It's great that the three of us are able to give such a well-rounded perspective of our time in Glasgow, because I'm going to talk about more of a social movement analysis from a food sovereignty frame, I would say, about COP26 and what it was like for me and what it was like through the Via Campesina. So I'm just organizing myself here really quick. All right, so yeah, a lot of the work that was going on outside of the formal negotiations of COP26, known as the Climate Fringe, was organized by a coalition of activists who set up a really incredible program of dialogues, of panels, assemblies, the climate marches that took place. And they really made an effort to ensure voices for distinct movements had opportunities to share their perspectives and demands. So as we all know, the National Farmers Union is a founding member of the Via Campesina, which is the transnational social movement of peasant, small scale and family farmers rooted in the collective struggles towards food sovereignty through agroecology. And though this was our first time as an organization, as the National Farmers Union attending COP26, the Via Campesina has been participating in the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change for 15 years. However, Via Campesina didn't actually have a formal delegation at this COP because, as the other two speakers mentioned, the vaccine apartheid, where vaccines are being withheld due to restrictive intellectual property patents and hoarding in the global north, and restrictive border access to the United Kingdom, made it nearly impossible for a lot of members of the Via Campesina from the global south to attend. So the movement made a political choice not to send a delegation. But some folks did end up going, like ourselves and a few other organizations from Europe and an organization from Puerto Rico. So in this photo, you can see kind of how we debriefed and talked about our analyses of the day at COP26. We sat in a circle. You can see some of the flags in the middle there. Those represent some of the organizations. And we did this on a daily basis, sharing meals, sharing cultural exchanges through what we call Mystica, and then analyzing the proceedings and making strategies through a food sovereignty perspective. And we were really grateful that we had the Land Workers Alliance, which is more or less the NFU's counterpart in the UK. They were hosting us and they rented a really great event space for a couple of weeks so that we could have our meals there and share our time together. Can you go to the next slide, please? So this is a photo of one of the panels that I spoke on with a number of folks from the Via Campesina, and then also two members of the World Association of Mobile Indigenous and Pastoralists, which was a panel talking about agroecology as a real solution to the climate crisis and peasant-led struggles around the world. And that was a really fantastic panel to be a part of. Can you go to the next photo, Becca? And this is a photo from one of the climate marches. You can see Maddie, she's from Ontario. She's in the middle there. And the Land Workers Alliance helped organize a huge farmers block, they called it, during the climate march, which was really exciting. And lots of people from all across the UK came out to support. Lots of farmers were there as well. It was really exciting. Okay, next photo, please, Becca. So this photo I want to stop on for a little bit because even though we had a small group, we did focus a lot on what we could do despite our small numbers to raise our voices about, the inequities that were showing themselves at COP26, and also to make sure that we could center food sovereignty as a way forward to food systems transformation in the wake of the climate crisis. So here you can see a photo of an action that we did in the blue zone, which is the formal negotiation space, calling out the false solutions and highlighting how our voices as small-scale peasant farmers were being co-opted or silenced altogether by the larger agribusiness interests. And it was really well received. There were lots of folks walking by that stopped, asked questions, gave interviews with the media afterwards. And so what we saw with COP26 with regard to how agriculture narratives, and Stu did a really great job of explaining how some of these dominant narratives played out. These narratives are not new, unfortunately. The private sector, whether transnational corporations or mega philanthropies, usually the two together, are really fearful about how real climate solutions would impact their bottom lines and those of their investors and shareholders, especially when those real solutions are based on what Stu was talking about, those silver bullet kind of high tech, high cost solutions. So the lack of real transformative policy alternatives to these status quo market-led food and agriculture systems is not unique to COP26. It's really permeating all the food and farming policy spaces at the UN level, whether at the Committee on World Food Security, the recent UN Food Systems Summit. All of these spaces are being captured by corporate influence and this kind of new age multi-stakeholderism, insofar that CEOs have the same level of negotiating power in some spaces as state leaders. And we see this all the time as civil society fights to have language around human rights, around food sovereignty, around agroecology, play a more dominant role in shaping food and agriculture policy. Next slide, please. So on a more positive note, our connection with the Via Campesina was a really great opportunity for movement building, not only within the Via Campesina, but also across other social movements, whether they were there supporting Indigenous rights, migrant rights, disability rights. Across the board, there were tons of social movements on the ground in Glasgow. And I was really interested in understanding how these movements were coalescing under the banner of climate justice, and what this looks like for the food sovereignty movement. So again, much of this work was happening outside of the formal spaces, but this photo here is a neat example of where it did permeate the formal space, which is when hundreds of civil society walked out on the last day of the formal negotiations. And something that that really stood out for me, and this may seem kind of like an obvious observation, but was really how the strength of civil society multiplies when we understand one another's demands and contexts. And in particular, I think a deeper understanding of how marginalized peoples already facing multiple forms of discrimination via colonialism, imperialism, patriarchal structures are experiencing the climate crisis. In our context on Turtle Island, I think this is particularly important to understand Indigenous peoples' relationships to the land and how they're suffering under the climate crisis, and in the context of colonialism. So I'd like to give the next 5 or 6 minutes or so to show you a really incredibly powerful speech that was given at the People's Plenary on the final day of the formal negotiations. So after 2 weeks of civil society organizing together, sharing analysis, this People's Plenary that took place held in the main plenary hall of the formal negotiation space gave an opportunity for presentations by Indigenous peoples, by farmers and peasants, by youth, women and gender non-binary folks, trade unions, disabled peoples, gave statements imploring governments to take bold actions in the last few hours of the negotiations. So that's where this picture comes in again, is after that plenary, hundreds of people walked out carrying a red cloth. You can go to the next photo. A red cloth symbolizing a red line that had been crossed by the COP in not delivering just and urgent outcomes needed to avoid really full planetary meltdown. So this photo here, the woman wearing the blue mask, her name is Marissa Reyes, and she spoke on behalf of the farmers constituency. She's a peasant farmer from Puerto Rico. Next photo. And this photo is, you can see Stu in the background holding the red line that I just mentioned. It was carried out from the main negotiation space out into the streets. And the next slide, I fear I may go over time a little bit, but I really want to show this video. So this statement was given by, her name is Takaya Blaney, and she was speaking on behalf of the Indigenous Peoples constituency. And Takaya is from the Sleeman First Nation, which is part of the Coast Salish Indigenous peoples on the west coast of Turtle Island in so-called British Columbia. So I'll leave it at that, and yeah, please watch and listen.
Can you hear it?
Turn it up a little bit.
Can you start over and turn it up?
No, we're not.
Afters, Tod Ojas, Potlatches, Quas, Takaya, Quatum, Pod Uksha, Yakmatoj, Noam Chichoy, Emat, Edge out on a pitch. I raise my hands to all of you here. Those words come from my kukpa, my grandfather, who gave me my name, Chigajimo. My given name is Takaya Blaney. I'm from the Tla'amin Nation. I'm from the Salish Sea. My lands and waters are under the genocidal illegal occupation of the Canadian government, resource extraction industries, and international corporations that are bleeding us dry of our birthright. The salmon, the cedars, the soil. Climate change bleeds us of our birthright. But climate change is merely a symptom of the most significant destructive force responsible for taking our lands and lives every day, and that is colonialism. Myself and all my relatives here have been criminalized, surveilled, and experienced violence at the hands of the police, at the hands of RCMP, and injunctions issued by our colonial governments to remove us from our lands when we get in the way of profit. I came here to witness the same Canadian politicians that sanction Indigenous genocide, land dispossession, and extractive projects without free, prior, and informed consent at an international forum for climate. I witnessed Justin Trudeau pose for pictures with Indigenous land defenders. Meanwhile, land defenders are taken as political prisoners back home. COP26 is a performance. It's an illusion constructed to salvage capitalist economies rooted in resource extraction and colonialism. I didn't come here to fix the agenda, I came here to disrupt it. Colonialism is what caused climate change, and I am not going to my colonizer for solutions. We reject colonial solutions for climate change. Nature-based solutions and carbon markets are false solutions that are rooted in the commodification of nature. When I say nature, I'm not talking about some colonial concept of what the environment is that is detached from our spirits and our belonging. I'm talking about our lands, our territories, our birthright, our kitchens, our fridges. I have not witnessed world leaders pay any attention to our climate futures. I've witnessed the negotiation of trade agreements because that's what carbon markets are. Trade agreements between settler colonial governments are no victories. They are distractions. Every day, Indigenous people are criminalized, incarcerated, murdered, disappeared because of industries propelling climate change. And climate change is not a blameless phenomenon. There are names behind it. There are governments behind it. There are corporations behind it. Canada, the US, Enbridge, CN Rail, just to name a few of those involved. This summer on the West Coast, there was a heat dome that caused 600 deaths, wiped out our clam beds, our shellfish. There was a fire in my relative's homeland in Inklakatmuk territory, and environmental organizations want to posture that as an example of climate change without naming the corporation responsible for that fire, and that is CN Rail. CN Rail caused that fire in Enclacatmook territory. And that is what I'm talking about when I say that climate change is not a blameless phenomenon, and we can't divorce the names of these corporations and governments responsible, because they're here right now and they're ignoring us and they're salvaging their profit and they're getting away with it. We can't get too comfortable within these systems. We can't get too comfortable at COP26. We need to be fighting for COP26 to be obsolete. As West Coast people, we are people of transformation. Our stories of creation are rooted in transformative beings. I believe in our ability to transform. I believe in our ability to outlive and to survive. I don't believe in the power of colonial systems to transform, because they don't have that magic. They don't have that power. We will outlive this. We will outlive these empires that were built on our genocide. Our ancestors survived many apocalypses. And when we talk about this climate apocalypse, you know, we're going to survive it too, but it's going to come from the people. And I hope when you go home, you keep your eyes on the front lines, you keep your eyes on Indigenous land defenders that are risking our lives to protect what everyone is pretending to care about here. Because the RCMP and colonial policing are direct arms of climate change, and they protect it. They protect colonialism, they protect climate change. And we need your support, and we need your attention, because that's where the real fight is. Thank you.
Thanks for watching that, everybody. It's really hard to just start talking again after that, because that's a really powerful statement. It's really important, I think, that we sit with these words and this idea and not just hear them, but actually act on them. And of course, advocating for better agriculture policy that helps farmers adapt and mitigate to this climate crisis is key. But really, our efforts are fraught if we don't engage with wider discussions of climate justice and Indigenous rights here on Turtle Island, because we can't fight the climate crisis siloed in our own issues or in our own sectors. Collective struggle is really the only way forward. And this is something that's really been cemented in me after COP26. And as Stu said, the important work to do is that with which we undertake at home. And for me, that piece includes uplifting and understanding, and not only saying we're in solidarity, but actually acting in solidarity with Indigenous peoples across this land. So I think I will leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Jessie. Thank you for that presentation and that incredibly powerful video. Really, really appreciated. Those were three fantastic presentations from Jessie and Stuart and Glenn. And we're going to turn to questions for our three presenters in a moment. But before we do that, I just want to give just a little bit more background on the NFU's work in Scotland at the COP26 talks and outside in the side events and counter demonstrations. The three NFU leaders that you saw present today were 3 out of the 7 people that went and represented the NFU. And I just want to acknowledge some of the others that went, and also some of those who helped make all of this happen. So in addition to Jessie, Stuart, and Glenn, Tiffany Traverse was there and represented the National Farmers Union, as did Madeline Marmore, Anastasia Fick, and Shannon Wright. So the NFU is deeply grateful for the time and all the work that those people put in, not just in Scotland, but in the months and months leading up. It was a tremendous amount of logistical work to make that happen. And helping out with all that logistical work was Taryn Giacomini, who worked tirelessly on this, Mara Shaw, Joan Lang, and our president, Katie Ward, and others. I hope I haven't missed anybody, but a huge group of people came together starting early last summer to make this all happen. So thanks to everybody who did that. Okay, we're just going to turn to questions now. We have about 25 minutes for questions. To ask your question, raise your Zoom hand and I will unmute you. One of our technicians will unmute you and you will have 1 minute to ask your question. If you're using the phone, press *9 to raise your hand and we will call on you when it's your time to ask a question. If on the off chance you don't have a microphone on your computer, raise your Zoom hand to indicate that you'd like to ask a question, then type your question into the chat along with your name. One of our technicians will read it so that everyone can hear. To raise your Zoom hand, click on the hand icon under all of the names on the right-hand side of your screen. If you don't see a white panel with all the participants' names listed, click the Participants button located at the bottom of your display. The Participants panel should then be visible with the raise hand button located underneath the names. If you're on the telephone, again, press *9 and we'll see your raised hand. Please keep your speaking time to a minute or less. We want to accommodate a lot of questions. So let's go ahead with some questions. Just give people a moment to find the raise hand button. I see Don Saparis has his hand up. Don, go ahead and unmute yourself and ask a question.
Thank you, Darren. Great presentations by all three speakers. I'm just curious, the modes of transportation for globalization, jet and water transport have been sort of understood to be exempt, but wondering if there's any changes afoot to correct the behavior and activities of those two modes of transportation as globalization continues on.
I think, accepting that I'm not an expert in aviation climate policy, but I think one of the things that I do feel qualified to comment on is some of the biggest emitters, aviation sector and also the oil and gas sector. I think how you see these sectors largely dealing with the issue of emissions reduction, or the public perception of dealing with emissions reductions, is to embrace offsets, and some of it's technologically based, like developing more efficient engines and things of that nature in the case of aviation, but also you see sort of a wholehearted embracing of net zero as a concept and as a pledge, and also working towards offsetting. And I think the danger, as Glenn touched on, the danger with offsets is that they're either based on technology which has not proved out conceptually or doesn't exist, like carbon capture and storage, or it's based on a misunderstanding of the potential of carbon sequestration around the world, where, if you added up all the net zero pledges of all the countries and all the biggest companies in the world, there's not enough land in the world to possibly sequester all the carbon that they're saying they're going to offset their emissions with. So we need to be very careful about the degree to which we embrace this as a climate solution, and be careful not to end up just with another market that people can invest and speculate on.
Would any of the presenters like to say something on that, or before I move on to another question?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to it, Don, but maybe you and I could take it offline, because I'm sure we could chat for probably an hour on this issue. But necessity is the mother of invention. And unfortunately, though, I do think the oil industry currently has a stranglehold on a lot of these things, almost a monopoly. But there is going to be some difficult choices that have to be made, because not all technologies are, there's no such thing as a free lunch, I guess. There are always unintended consequences, but on the Tidewater thing, I think it's probably easier to do something than it is with aviation, but both of them could be addressed.
Okay. Thank you.
Thanks very much for the question. Thanks for the answers.
Hey, Darren,
Matthew,
can I just
sorry, go ahead.
interject just to spotlight what Jesse wrote in the chat, is that emissions from military are exempt from all of Canada's pledges, which is an important point because it represents a massive amount of emissions creation in the name of quote unquote national defense. So something that we need to question more carefully, certainly in the future.
For sure. Thanks for that. Matthew Leans, I see you have your hand up. Please unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, thank you, Darren. So I love these presentations and strongly agree with the conclusion of the last presentation that we have to seek solutions in partnership with the Indigenous folks around us. And so that's less tangible maybe than where my question is going, but I'm curious whether any discussions at COP centered around what I recently resigned from a government position where I was focused on agriculture, greenhouse gas emissions, and what I came to understand is the two biggest challenges for agriculture are fossil fuel consumption and nitrous oxide emissions from our fertilizer use. Any interesting discussions around those two challenges we face?
I'm not aware of any specific focus on decarbonization of agriculture at the conference. Leading up to COP26, though, in terms of Canada, Canada made some comments about 30% emissions reduction associated with fertilizer. And Darren could probably speak to that much more so as well. But I will say that when I was in the green zone, though, I went to COP, and I've always been very critical of hydrogen as a technology in terms of powering engines to displace diesel fuel instead, to pull your air drill or run a combine. And I had a very long chat with an engineer from JCB. They're an industrial machine manufacturer. They had demonstration machines there. They were releasing the technology of hydrogen internal combustion engines. So I do believe, after speaking to him and really pressuring him and challenging him on whether this would actually work as a decarbonized solution for agriculture, I do have hope, and I'm much more encouraged that we could actually decarbonize agriculture with internal combustion hydrogen powered machines.
I know that, oh, sorry, Jesse.
That's okay. I think something that has been spotlighted not only at COP, but at other policy spaces at the UN where agriculture is on the table is things like precision agriculture that are really being championed by kind of the corporate partners that Stu mentioned, but in reality are only solutions insofar as they're allowing the same kind of corporate actors kind of continue with their status quo approaches to the market-based agriculture system, but while they can say they're using fewer agrochemicals in this precision agriculture setup, that they may in fact be substituting them for increased technology in gene-edited or genetically modified seeds. So I think that in terms of fertilizers, at least, that's been a contentious point in a lot of policy negotiation spaces, because the solutions that are coming on the table are those that are being presented by the same chemical companies that have been pushing the fertilizers and the like all the while.
I think in order to make, when you're calling for the reduction of something, you necessarily run into arguments of, and when it comes to nitrogen fertilizer specifically, the side that's responsible for selling nitrogen fertilizer makes the aggressive argument that, well, if you reduce this at all, it means that you're sacrificing yield, and then they equate that to taking money out of the pockets of farmers, which to anybody that looks at these beyond the surface level understands it's not a 1 + 1 = 2 type of relationship between those things. And but you're up against a lot of money. on the other side of the conversation and a lot of credibility on the other side of the conversation. And farmers are in such a tight spot financially these days that the idea of bearing any more risk or the idea of having to spend any more money on any kind of adaptive strategy is a hard sell. So that's where the government really needs to be playing a role to provide reliable science-based information and to help fund support for farmers to be adopting strategies which can make these on-farm practices more practical to implement, and on the margins is where we can have an absolutely massive effect when it's compounded over a whole country's worth of practices.
Thanks, Stuart. Glenn, you have your hand up. You're muted, Glenn.
Sorry about that. Yeah, I just wanted to say that in tandem with what Stuart just talked about, there's a question from Sunday Harrison about what Canadian farm policy should we be supporting. I just want to direct everybody on the line back to the two reports the NFU has already issued, one on tackling the farm crisis and the climate crisis. There's a whole mountain of information in there as to how we need to approach farming in order to reduce our emissions intensity, and a lot of great policy initiatives there. And then there's the Imagine If report as well, which was, I think, about 9 or 12 months after the tackling report. So both of those are excellent resources that you can find on the website and would very much give you a great direction as to what sort of policies we need to pursue in terms of Canadian agriculture.
Great, thanks for that, Glenn. Yeah, if you want to read those two reports, they're on www.nfu.ca, and just click the big blue button that says climate, and you'll very quickly get to those two reports. Thank you. Ann Slater, you have your hand up. Please go ahead, unmute yourself and ask your question.
Yeah, I was just thinking back to the video that that Stuart showed us, and all the the scenes of all kinds of greens and whatever growing inside containers or whatever, and that's often put out as a solution to that we're going to just grow all these greens in our cities close by. And I remember last year being on a meeting that was organized by the Globe and Mail and Evan Fraser from the University of Guelph, really promoting that as a climate solution. But it's something that comes back to us as small market growers, market gardeners, that moving our lettuce into hydroponic, into containers, into greenhouses is a solution. So anyway, I was just looking for any comments about that.
I'll take a stab at that one first. Yeah, and I think these are exactly the kind of high input, high cost solutions that are trying to be sold to farmers right now under the thin veil of this sort of greenwashed climate solution more broadly. And I think that's something that we talked about a lot in our Via Campesina group. There was, I mean, agroecology, it's a bit of a mouthful to say, but the practices and the methodologies themselves are actually fall in line with what a lot of farmers, and I know a lot of people in the NFU, are already doing on their farms. And learning a little bit more about that is a great way for all of us to kind of combat these kind of false solution narratives that are being pushed by the big ag that want market gardeners to buy these, why don't you start a hydroponic farm? It's only going to cost you $100,000 and you won't have to use soil anymore. It's like, why would we do that when we can talk to our neighbor down the road who just developed this really great mulching technique, and they're saving a bunch of their water and growing beautiful looking greens. And I think it's this kind of knowledge transfer that is really a part of agroecology that you don't see in a lot of other sort of the kind of like the certification based farming schemes, is that the importance set on farmer to farmer knowledge is really, really high. So I think that's one of the biggest solutions that I look to in my toolbox of, on my farm combating the climate crisis, is learning from other farmers how they're adapting and mitigating on their farms, and how I can take some of those solutions back to mine, and keep passing on that knowledge from farm to farm, and not looking like what was shown in that video, and instead using what we already have.
Thanks for that response, Jesse. Stuart or Glenn, do you want to weigh in on that before I go to the next question? Go. Okay, before I take Kathleen's question, I'll just point out that when the team was in Glasgow, the 7 members of the NFU contingent, they put out a lot of news releases commenting on various aspects of the talks, on side agreements, on the marches in the street, on international solidarity work and other things. So if you want more detail, there's several pages of news releases there. You can go to the NFU.ca website and have a look at those releases, and you'll learn more about the work there. Kathleen Gibson, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure. Hi there. I was so happy that the NFU sent folks there. I had a great chat with Stuart when he was in Glasgow. Thank you, Stuart. And here I was in Victoria, BC, trying to find out what was happening in the session while it was underway. There were a lot of side events, and one of them was called Agriculture's Climate Ambition, which was hosted by the Canadian Federation of Agriculture and the UK's NFU. And it had a woman there from East Africa, Elizabeth Simondala. So I was curious to know if any of our 7 was in that session and what you thought about it. And then I'll throw into the chat, there was a very interesting other side discussion in one of the pavilions, and I couldn't figure out where it was. Food Tank hosted a session on what does a just transition for meat look like. And it started with an interview with the CEO of Aleph Farms in Israel. And then there was quite a high level, very interesting panel that included people from Via Campesina. So I'm curious if any of our delegates heard either of those presentations, and particularly curious about that side event on agriculture's climate ambition. Thanks.
Thanks, Kathleen, for those questions. On the first question, I don't think that we had anyone at that particular session, regrettably. As you rightly pointed out, there were literally hundreds of side events happening on a daily basis, and that one obviously slipped through our fingers, although it would have normally been one that we would have sent somebody to for sure. So I can't comment too heavily on that one, but on the second one, I wasn't actually there, but I did talk to somebody who was there, and certainly the livestock was front of mind. When agriculture did come up, often livestock was not too far behind in a conversation around it. And that's partly because there's difficulty on both sides of the livestock coin in how it's being talked about in public spaces. On the one side, there's a recognition that there's a great degree of emissions that are coming from methane and enteric fermentation. And then on the polar opposite side, there is a very strong ethical-based argument that is coming from sort of the vegan corner, which says that animal agriculture is universally bad and and we should end all animal agriculture. So the issue is, regrettably, for those people that are searching for and implementing good faith solutions on livestock production, they get sandwiched into those big behemoths, those 2 big behemoths of conversation. And the reality, like many of these issues, is not black and white, and there's a good degree of nuance in the middle, which is, where if there's a right way, is where the middle is. I mean, I'm a vegetable farmer, and I am very much so dependent on animal agriculture and the fertility that comes from animal agriculture, and can't imagine being able to grow vegetables sustainably long term without animals playing a role. Even though we don't keep animals on our farm, we do bring in outside fertility. And when we're talking about reducing inputs such as synthetic nitrogen, then animal fertility is one of the most ready-made sources of fertility that's out there, and that's not even touching upon what grass-based rotational grazing can do for building positive soil health on, in particular, in grass-based landscapes like the prairies, and what a positive effect it can have there. So it's often the conversations are not like that, and when you get CEO of Beyond Meat making claims like he wants to eliminate all meat in the next decade, it is a misrepresentation really of the climate piece, as the ethical piece gets brought into it under the guise of a climate lens. And so I think we have to be careful with that argument, and really try to see through to the facts of the situation, and not
I
get
think
too
there's a
distracted.
massive educational potential piece here about soil and livestock.
Yeah.
And future of food. And I'm looking forward to what our delegation and the rest of you come up with that the membership can do to support those actions you talked about. Now we're home, like there's more work to do. Now you're back and we can help. So looking forward to those. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for that question, and thanks for that great answer. We've got about 5 minutes left in the Q&A session. I'm going to go to Marcella Peterson. Marcella, unmute yourself, please, and ask your question.
Hi, I missed some of the questions, so this might be the big ag lobby wants to provide us with more technology, which may be helpful to farmers, but how do we keep the information collected by us, with us, and not be handed over to the giants to use the information against us? And I wondered if anything was like that was covered in COP26. And secondly, I'm concerned about investments. How and who can we encourage agroecology investments, or avoid, like we might be providing investments that are working against us when we don't know who they're actually supporting. So if any of that information came up out of COP26 would be appreciated.
Who'd like to field that question?
Well, I'll take a shot at it. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that many of the corporate actors that are there are looking at climate change and any transition as an opportunity to make money. And what you mentioned already with respect to big data in agriculture and who owns that data, I mean, we've got some legal issues to consider here, because if the past trends are any indication, you can see that corporate control is likely going to try and exploit farmers. And so I guess what I worry about with any of these new technologies is, in certain sectors, perhaps things like basic necessities related to food and related to health and shelter, we really should be taking a hard look at intellectual property and patent protection, because I'm not sure how wise it is to allow capitalism to have a free license to make money on the backs of people that suffer. And that's largely what caused the vaccine apartheid. And so if we don't get that under control, I mean, you're right, the investments that are being made could lead to more inequality.
Thank you very much. Stuart Wells, I see you have your hand up, and I think you will be our last question for the day. Please go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Darren, and thanks for the presentations. They were great. Unfortunately, this is no small question. I want all three panelists to put their prime ministerial shoes on and tell me what they would do if they were prime minister tomorrow. Where would they start? Given their research and their experience on the international stage, what would they do here in Canada? Thanks.
Love the question, love to answer. I think the two places that I would start are, one, I would codify food sovereignty into legislation and give people the legal framework in which to sue the government and force it to be accountable and to see food as more than a commodity, and it gives us the leeway to do more. And the second piece, I think, is to put more money into the hands of farmers to be able to adopt and implement practices on their farms to have a tangible effect on agricultural emissions. And the government is doing that in part, but who the money goes to and how, and whether it just ends up in the coffers of agribusiness or whether it ends up on the actual farms in terms of making the changes that need to be made in order to guarantee we have a food system, and also that farmers can implement the practices at the same time as the two spots that I would probably shoot for.
I'm going to jump in because I feel like Stuart stole my first one. So now I'm going to second his answer, but also add that in addition to codifying food sovereignty, to also increase financing for agroecology and training and education initiatives for agroecology, so that this generation and the next generations of farmers have opportunities to learn and understand agriculture in ways that are not top-down and corporate-led sort of initiatives, and away from the industrial model. And the second item, well, which probably would be done first, is actually guaranteeing and giving money back to Indigenous peoples, including territorial lands back, and also ensuring that their sovereignty is respected in terms of their traditional territories. Thanks for the question, Stuart.
Wow, Stuart, that's one heck of a question, and this is a tough act to follow, but I'm, I guess, a little bit different. I want to start by telling just a brief story. In the marches, I carried a Canada flag for many reasons, one of which is to attract journalists or other people with any connection to Canada. But while doing so, I mean, it's the first trip I'd ever made overseas to Europe, and I was always told the Canada flag should bring you warmth and to be well received. But to my surprise, probably 15% of the people who came up to me with that flag were challenging me, saying that Canada has no place to be even in this march because they've got an awful record with respect to Indigenous oppression, or an awful record with respect to pollution and emissions. And so, you know, to me, it's very obvious that the corporate control of Canada has gone too far. So when you ask me the first thing that I would do as Prime Minister, well, first of all, I've got to say that the best decisions are made by many people, not by one dictator, and there's too much control in the PM's office. So my first act as Prime Minister would be to strengthen our democracy. What we need actually is electoral reform. We need tighter legislation with respect to lobbying. We need tighter legislation and control of political finance. We need to lower the voting age to 14 and make sure that all children, when they're going through school, get exposed to the political process and can participate. Because without participatory democracy, this corporate control is just going to go on and end badly. So the next thing that I would do, though, specifically related to climate, is I would end all public finance of fossil fuel infrastructure and projects. And we actually had a press release to that extent. If you look at one of our releases made during COP26, and short of being put on the spot here and given my stump speech that wasn't well prepared, those are the things I think that I would want to see us focus on first and foremost.
Great. Thanks to Stuart for that great closing question. And thanks to Glenn and Jesse and to Stuart for the fantastic presentations and all the great answers, and for everyone that participated and the people that worked behind the scenes. Rebecca, can you put the last slide of our deck up? I just want to talk about the upcoming events here. And thanks again to Glenn, Stuart, and Jesse. So just a few reminders about upcoming NFU events. Our next NFUniversity session is in the new year, Thursday, January 13th at noon Pacific time. The speakers will be Lydia Carpenter and Paul Slump, and the title of their presentation is Great Grass, Grazing Management and Climate Resilience. So please join us January 13th for a session on grass, grazing, soils, climate resilience. There's huge interest in this issue in the National Farmers Union, and we've got some great young farmers who are working on the land, rotationally grazing, building soils, growing grass, and using that grass to grow more soil. So it should be an absolutely fantastic session. and really urge you to get to that. We'll have the registration up for that shortly. Just go to nfu.ca and click on the blue button marked NFUniversity. We've posted a link in the chat. Note also that the recordings of past NFUniversity classes are posted on the NFU's website and on our YouTube channel. A link to that YouTube channel is posted in the chat. And remember, if you're not yet an NFU member, please sign up today. Finally, we'd encourage all attendees to provide feedback on today's event via SurveyMonkey. We'll post a link in the chat for that. Your feedback on this event will help us make future NFUniversity sessions even better. Okay, that ends the formal part of our presentation today. For those of you who'd like to stay for the informal discussion, please remain connected to Zoom. For the rest of you, thanks again for attending. We hope you enjoyed the session and you will join us for future NFUniversity classes. We'll give those of you that need to leave a few minutes to sign off of Zoom. And then Rebecca will set up a number of smaller chat rooms and people will hang out and continue the conversation for about 15 minutes. Then we'll return to this space to say goodbye. So see you in one of the breakout rooms or see you at the next NFUniversity session. Thanks, everyone.